Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to the VPS Spotlight Research Program. This program is designed to run for 30 minutes today, so we'll do our best to stay on time. Today, we have a presentation by Dr. Brian Flaherty. He's an associate professor in the Division of Critical Care and Hospital Medicine at the University of Utah, and his primary attending work is at Primary Children's Hospital there in Salt Lake. Brian completed his fellowship in critical care there, and recently, from what I understand, is he received his master's in clinical informatics. He has been heavily involved with the teaching programs there at the University of Utah, currently has over 32 publications. And today he's got something that he's been working on for a while and actually working with VPS internally also. And he's going to talk about his publication, which was published in the Journal of Hospital Pediatrics, volume 11 last March. So it's fairly recent. It's also a publication that's not necessarily easy for you to grab onto. I had to do a little bit of hunting to actually print it off for myself. But at any rate, you have the DOI information there, so hopefully you can gather in the information. The title of it is the Probabilistic Linkage creates a novel database to study bronchiolitis care in the PICU. And I think it's going to be very interesting to hear the mechanism and what this might entail for future studies. So we'll have time at the end for questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Flaherty. Brian?
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Rice. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Well, fantastic. Well, I'll go ahead and share some slides and we'll get going here. All right, and just double check everyone's seeing the presenter view of slides, or the presentation, I should say.
Got it.
Yes. Fantastic. Well, thank you all for your time today. I'm going to go ahead and dive right into the work that we are, I want to say done with, but you're never really done with things. It's just one step to the next. Um, so some funding disclosures. The bulk of the work that I'm going to talk about today was supported by internal grants here at the University of Utah and the Primary Children's Hospital Foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit about ongoing work that has been directly funded by VPS and the Children's Hospital Association, which manages the FIS database. So a little bit of an outline. I'm going to talk about some of the motivations for this project. The bulk of the time, we're going to talk about this project to link data to study bronchiolitis. And at the end, I'll touch on some of our ongoing and future work. And so, by way of interest and background, I am a database researcher. And the motivation for this project was really to help solve a problem we have, I think, in PICU-based research, where we don't have a great singular database to go out and answer questions, especially looking at things like medication or intervention effectiveness. And to really look at those questions, you need a data source that can, at a very granular and accurate level, let you know what it is the patient was really in the PICU for, as opposed to all the things that might happen to them in the course of a hospitalization. You need to know something about the interventions, whether that be surgeries, procedures, medications, different diagnostic studies that were done to the patient, their outcomes. And then something that I think is very limited in the sources that provide it are good measures of covariates, so demographics, comorbidities, and ICU level severity of illnesses. And so about 5 to 6 years ago, when our group was really trying to think about how we could solve this data problem, we had talked about the VPS as well as the FIS, or Pediatric Hospital Information System, FIS database. And when we look at these, we really realize, boy, if we could somehow fit these together, we would have a data set that could really unlock a lot of ICU level research. And the table here displays some of the unique attributes of each of the databases as well as some of their common variables. And so when we think about putting together two data sets, there's two broad approaches to it. The first is known as deterministic or direct linkage. And this is something you can do if you have a specific subject identifier that is common to two data sets. And you can essentially just match two subjects, one from each data set, together as one record if they match exactly on that singular variable. Unfortunately, when trying to put FIS and VPS data together, there are some limits on patient identifiers that you can use, and there's not a single common patient identifier where you can just directly link subjects together. The other way to link data sets is something known as probabilistic or indirect linkage. And the kind of one sentence explanation of this is you join records together based on the probability that they are referring to the same subject based on how much they agree or disagree over a set of common variables. For those of you that are board game fans, that may have sounded kind of like the game Guess Who. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, it's a two-player game where in front of each player there's a board that has pictures of all these different potential characters. Each player randomly selects a card that is one of these characters, and that's your person. And the object of the game is to try and guess who the other player has as their person. And gameplay goes back and forth where you ask a question about a feature, you get an answer, and based on that, you can rule out or rule in some of these characters until you're down to one. And so a similar idea happens with probabilistic linkage. And instead of person features like hair color or eye color, we can look at things like gender, race, ethnicity, what procedures were done to a patient, what day of the week they may have come into the hospital. And the idea is that based on the distribution of the variables and how well two subjects match or sorry, agree or don't agree on a series of variables, is you can calculate an actual probability that a record in database A and a record in database B actually refer to the same subject. And that's the underlying principle of probabilistic linkage. So now moving into our actual paper to talk about, like I said, we were interested in solving a data problem. Our group is specifically interested in looking at the care of bronchiolitis, which happens to be, for most ICUs, their leading diagnosis, and there happens to be a ton of variability in care with very little data. And the specific aim for this little piece of the project was to use probabilistic linkage to link VPS and FIS records for our single hospital. And because we were using our hospital in parallel, we were able to create a data set that had specific patient identifiers and create essentially a reference data set using direct linkage methods. And our ultimate goal was to compare the accuracy of our probabilistic linkage to a reference direct linkage. So the patients we looked at were essentially a year's worth of patients at our hospital. We looked at patients who had at least one ICU day stay or more. The reason for that is a little bit of the intricacies of the FIS database, where there is a flag based on ICU billing charges that only appears if someone is in the hospital for over one calendar day. And to make our initial attempt a little bit easier, we wanted to limit the number of FIS patients, which includes all hospitalizations, ER visits and observation visits in a hospital, down to just those subjects that had a PICU stay, to match up with our VPS records, which were only patients who'd had a PICU stay. And then we ultimately focused on patients that had a VPS primary diagnosis of bronchiolitis, because that was our disease of interest. In terms of the probabilistic linkage, the common variables that we use between the FIS and VPS data sets are displayed on the right. And for this, we used a software known as LinkSolve. When you run these probabilistic linkages, you have the potential for a probability score to come up for every possible match between the two records, or sorry, between the two data sets. So you can get a ton of potential matches for each VPS record. For the purposes of this study, we only accepted to analyze the highest probability match for each VPS record. And then once again, we used our reference deterministic linkage to look at false positive and false negative rates in our probabilistic linkage. To create our reference linkage, we used a staged approach. We used various combinations of patient-specific and hospitalization-specific data or values to accept a match. And then our kind of three stages are listed here. To measure our probabilistic linkage accuracy, once again, we use that reference data set to identify any false positives. So records we matched that weren't actually a match, and false negatives, and that's a VPS record that should have matched with a FIS record but did not. To look to see if our method created any bias in those VPS records that we couldn't match. As a last step, we compared some demographic and clinical characteristics of the VPS records that we were able to match against those that we were not. And so our results. So within our hospital's data set, we had 920 patients that had a diagnosis of bronchiolitis. Our direct linkage, as expected, was able to link 100% of those records. Our probabilistic linkage did quite well. We were able to link 839 out of the 920 records, so about a 91% linkage rate. That implies that our false negative, the records we were unable to link, was about 9%. And then we compared our linked records to our reference standard. We had about a 0.5% false positive rate. Our last piece of examination of our linkage was to compare some demographic and clinical characteristics of patients whose records we could link versus those that we could not. And as you can see here, in terms of age, gender, CCC is the abbreviation for complex chronic conditions. We looked at the PIM-3 severity of illness score, if patients were intubated or not, and their length of stay. And across all those variables, there was no difference. And when you actually look at the values themselves, there's really not much of the way of actual numeric difference between the two. So from this, we concluded that probabilistic linkage, at least in our pilot single hospital specific diagnosis circumstance, could create a very accurate set of linked records between FIS and VPS, and that our method was not introducing any bias in that there was a certain type of patient that was failing to link. And so at this point, we said, okay, this is great, but if we really want to study bronchiolitis and understand what treatments or testing might be beneficial to patients, we really need to expand out from one hospital in a relatively short time span. And so our goal that we're working on now is actually to try and link data from hospitals across the country. There are numerous hospitals that actually contribute data to both the FIS database and VPS. And while we're at it, we said, why not limit ourselves to just bronchiolitis? Let's try and do every diagnosis that is there. In other words, let's look at all the PICU patients that exist in VPS. And so right now, what we're completing is a linkage of data from 31 hospitals over 6 years. And we took all VPS records and we took all FIS records. And so by doing that, we're actually going to try and link the records for patients that even had that short, less than 1 day ICU stay that wouldn't trigger in FIS an indicator that they were in the PICU. Now, as we go and expand to a much, much larger patient or subject population with these expanded searches, we run the risk of increasing our false positive rate, or just the random chance that enough values and variables matched up between the two databases that someone erroneous was said to be a match. And so to try and limit that, we have been working with the leadership at FIS and VPS to get additional variables and more patient-specific variables. And so without getting into too much detail, the more granular or patient-specific a variable is, the better your probability of accurate matches becomes. And so what we've been able to work out with the two databases is to get a data set that included hashed or scrambled account and medical record numbers, as well as shifted dates. So some highly specific things that are common between the two databases. And this has opened up a slightly expanded strategy for linkage. So now, once again, looking at this giant national linkage, we've converted into two steps. The first is where we're going to do a direct linkage of subjects based on those highly specific patient and hospitalization numbers, as well as some dates. And then patients that did not match there dropped down into a second step where we essentially ran our probabilistic linkage algorithm that we just talked about. One interesting piece of a probabilistic linkage, as I mentioned, for each potential match between records from the different databases, you get a probability of how probable is it these are referring to the same subject. And eventually you have to identify a probability threshold above which you say it's a match and you move it forward to whatever analysis you want to done or do, below which you say, I don't think this is a match, and you don't move them forward. And so to help us understand in this massive data set where we should set that probability threshold, we looked at 4 hospitals, and we took all the subjects that were linked in the first step, that direct linkage, and we took those same subject and we ran them through our probabilistic linkage. And so we essentially are using, once again, a direct linkage as our reference. And based on that, we saw that around a threshold of 90% probability was where we were really minimizing our false positive rates. Below that, we had some false positives starting to sneak in. And so when we use that threshold, we've actually been able to link quite a few records. So what we looked at were about 320,000 VPS records. We had actually 3.5 million FIS records. Once again, that's FIS is everyone that has touched a hospital. VPS is patients that have come through the PICU. And thus far, we've been able to link just under 95% of the records. About 81% of those of the 320,000 records linked with that direct first step, and we add an additional 13% with the probabilistic step. And in those 4 hospitals that we were using as kind of our test case, we had 0 false positives. So we're hopefully a month or 2 away from finalizing this up and being able to send this information on linking back to FIS and VPS where it can start becoming usable data. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pause and see what questions folks have.
This is really an interesting study. And of course, you and I are aware of what we've been doing behind the scenes with the leadership at FIS and also at VPS to try and do this linkage in a broader set to do some interesting studies. And as I think many of the people on this call today know, the FIS linkage has been primarily designed originally as an administrative database. So it also has some cost/charge data in there, as well as meds and those kind of things, whereas the VPS has been pretty rich on the clinical stuff, but we've always avoided some of those other things like medications and charges. The diagnoses are put in on the medical side by abstractors, where in the FIS database, they're usually done by the medical abstractors in medical records for billing purposes. So there's variance along that line. But I think the way that your matching has gone looks very, very intriguing and is showing some really strong results here for us. I would also mention on my end that just for the people that are on the call, they may not all know that one of our problems had to do with PHI, and PHI sharing that means that we can't give out dates. And that's made us jump through these other hoops, moving the hashes and that kind of stuff. So again, we're trying to make sure that we've always got compliant data here. I don't know whether we've got questions. I see one showing up on here. Okay,
Yeah,
question,
so it
and
looks
go ahead.
I was going to say, it looks like the first question is this linkage process automated so it's continually updated? And so, unfortunately, it is not. And part of it is the complexity for actually getting us the data without identifiers. And I will say it has taken us, boy, I think it's been about a 2 year process. A lot of that was just figuring out data and transfer it. It's been a solid 12 to 18 months to really run the linkages. And a lot of it is just small intricacies in how one hospital enters data in FIS versus VPS, where there's all these little hiccups where moving forward, if a hospital changes how they do something, it would totally throw off an automated process if we were even able to automatically feed data in. But what we're hoping is we've created the coding infrastructure, and we now have the institutional knowledge of these little things to look for where, periodically we can take maybe 5 year chunks at a time and update this. So it's not going to be absolute real time, but we're going to be able to update it with some frequency.
Thanks, Brian. Looks like a few more questions are showing up here.
Yep. From Gerardo, he had a question about redoing the linkage and system. Yeah, we hope we'll be in a position where people will want to use this. It becomes a useful data tool where there is the desire to have it updated periodically, and we can do that. And then from Mindy Stewart, do you see this applying to inpatient essentials database, which is a subset within CHA that does not meet FIS criteria? And so the method of linking the data can apply essentially to any data set. It's simply a question of, are there enough variables with enough information content that you can separate out true matches from false matches? And I apologize, I don't know a lot about the essentials database and which hospitals are in it or not. When you compare the hospitals that are in FIS to the VPS network, VPS has many, many more hospitals. So as long as they have common hospitals, I would say in theory, it should be able to apply.
Right. I think I would mention, Brian, when we first started, we had, I think, out of the FIS group, which was, I think, something in the 50s, hospitals they had participating. I think we matched 37 or 38 units that were in both data sets. And right now you've done 31 or so, from
Yeah, and
what I
so
understand.
yep, and a little bit of that is we had some hospitals that just whether it was how the data was entered originally or going through the kind of hashing process, there were a lot of variables, especially the patient-specific ones we expected to match up that didn't. And so we think that could be something where a hospital has, a leading or trailing zero or does something to their numbers when they put it into FIS. And so there were some hospitals we dropped just because we couldn't reliably understand what had happened with their data. With that said, we were comfortable dropping a few hospitals because we knew we were going to still have so many thousands and thousands of records.
Don't see any other questions right at the moment. So I'm just going to say for the people that are listening, our intention was to do this, get it out, and then update it annually. I think what we found out is turned out to be a little more complex than we all first envisioned, at least on my end and the people at the VPS. But I think it's still in the thought process of updating this on some kind of a periodic basis. But I think annually is going to be a little bit much the way it looks right now. And we also haven't worked out the criteria for how people are going to utilize this because you can enter into requesting data from currently the use of the FIS data. You come in through a different way through the PICU node there. And in VPS, it's almost anybody that's associated with a participating unit in the VPS can access data. In order to use this right now, they're going to have to be a member of both data sets. So you're going to need to be a member of a FIS participating hospital as well as VPS to utilize it to get going here. At least that's our intention. And we don't really know exactly when it's going to be available because I think Brian brought up the thing that we're currently working on these flags that he mentioned. So it would be easier for a researcher to actually utilize the data and put the two data sets together with the link. Do we have any other questions? We'll give them a minute here to purge their thoughts here. Well, Brian, any last comments or thoughts about this?
I'm excited for it. This has essentially been a project I've been working on since I finished fellowship to try and figure out how to study these things, and it has become, oh, before I can do this, we need to figure out this, and back and forth kind of thing. So it's exciting to be done, and it's been great working with the team at VPS. They've been a ton of help, and we've had several calls where I've kind of pitched some pretty harebrained ideas on how to get data linked, and we're doing it.
Yep. And I would say the FIS people have been also very helpful to us in this. And along those lines, since probably it's been close to 20 years, we've been doing this at VPS, and we've always kind of wanted to link with CHA. And actually, CHA was one of our founding units, not units, but supporters, one of the original three participators in the VPS LLC. So it's always been out there. The big stumbling block has been this issue of the HIPAA compliance and trying to make it happen. So I think this time we've got solutions. We've got FIS on board, we've got VPS on board, and we've got Brian and the team there at the University of Utah working with us in a HIPAA compliant fashion, we think. So we're very happy that things are going this way and should have it available for the researchers to use. So again, thanks everyone for joining. Brian, congratulations. I think this is going to be a great asset to the pediatric critical care community. All your hard work and the rest of your team. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dr. Rice.
You bet, Brian. Bye-bye.